Hello and welcome. I'm glad you could be with me tonight. I have a wonderful, fantastic guest. Ellen Kennedy is back. I just realized that it had been 4 years since she'd been on. She's back to talk about human rights, about her great nonprofit, which is called Without Genocide. And we're going to also talk about some specific countries that are going through horrible times, as well as some things going on here in our country. So I'm very pleased you're with me tonight. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you, Mary. It's so good to be here
It's
again.
great to have you back. For those who didn't see the show back in 2014, or who don't know about your organization, just tell us how you started it. It's a great story, and
I would love to.
I want to hear the basics.
I'm very interested in coffee. I'm not a big coffee drinker, but coffee is grown in the poorest parts of the world for consumption in the richest. And a friend happened to mention that he had a friend who was a coffee importer here in the Twin Cities, and that I should go and meet his friend. So I got the contact information, and I did. I called the friend and said I would love to meet you, and he said, stop by. So I did. I went over after work, and he happened to mention 30 seconds into our conversation that he was going to Rwanda. He had invested some money in a small coffee cooperative in Rwanda that was run by women survivors of the genocide that happened in that country in 1994. Well, as it happened, Mary, I'm not only interested in coffee, but I also am a sociologist, and I had been teaching about the genocide in Rwanda. And I said to him, could I go with you? I had known him for 30 seconds. He said, of course. And then I said, could my husband come too? Again, he said, of course. 2 weeks later, my husband and I were with him in Rwanda, a small group of people traveling around the country. He was there, as I said, to visit this coffee cooperative. And there was somebody from the United States Agency for International Development office who had sort of been assigned to our little group as a translator, as a tour guide, a young woman, a Rwandan named Alice. And Alice was with us, guiding us, and really becoming a friend to me. She was a young woman, and one evening, sitting outside after I had known her for about a week, I said, Alice, may I ask what happened to you and your family in 1994? And I said, please feel free to say you'd rather not talk about it. And she shared her story with me about how in 1994 she was 14 years old. And one day in April, her mother asked her to go to the next village on an errand to her cousin's house and to pick something up and then to come right back home. And Alice said that she was a difficult teenager and did not go right back home. She stayed overnight and sat up late with her young cousins watching TV and playing games. The next morning when Alice got back home, she was the one to discover the bodies of her grandmother and her grandfather, her mother and father, her 12-year-old sister and her 9-year-old and 2-year-old brothers. They were victims of that brutal genocide. Alice was the only survivor in the family. And I was devastated because, as it turned out, Alice and my own daughter are the same age.
So it hit close to home, didn't it?
Absolutely. And I just felt shattered by that. A few days later, we were in a small museum in northwest Rwanda, and a museum about the genocide. And I went through and I read the panels about what had happened. And then as I was exiting, I saw a dirt path, and I walked down it, and there was a Quonset hut at the end of the path. And I went into the Quonset hut, and there were 6-foot tables, and they were filled with human remains, with people's skulls and bones that had been found in the nearby woods. They had not yet been properly identified and buried. I've been to terrible places. I've been to Auschwitz. I've been to the killing fields of Cambodia and so on. But there was a sense of immediacy from that. And I just fell apart. And Alice had followed me down that path, and she came in and she put her arms around me. And she said to me, Ellen, you don't have to look at this. This isn't your problem, she said. This is our problem, the Rwandans' problem. And she took me outside and just led me away. And I thought about those words, Mary, for a long time. And when I got back the following fall, I was teaching my classes again, and I was teaching them kind of patting myself on the back for having gone to Rwanda, for sharing stories, for explaining this personal experience to my students. And one of my students came up after class and she said, what are we going to do about this? And that was really a profound moment for me.
So we'd call it a turning point, isn't it, when I
Absolutely.
have thought about your life?
And it's what I call an enough moment. I had had enough of these injustices. And it was a moment when I felt I had to do something. Because my student felt everyone in the room should have been asking that question. What are we going to do about this? Including me. And I had not asked it, nor had anyone else. And it was at that moment that I felt I needed to do something. And that was what occasioned the birth of the organization.
And this was in what year, 2000?
This was in January of 2006 that we began.
Okay.
Yes.
And when you say you were teaching, I should have told you, she's an adjunct professor at Mitchell.
At Mitchell Hamlin School of Law.
School of Law now.
That's correct.
Formerly William Mitchell.
Right.
Stumbling over that yet. And so you then first involved your students, right?
Yes, and this goes back a number of years. And at the time I was at a different university, and I was teaching largely undergraduates. So I got young undergraduate students involved in these issues of human rights. And you know, they have become unbelievable in the 13 years since then, almost 13 years. They have gone on. One is now a professor herself, teaching about issues like this. Another one works with immigrant and refugee cases in New York. I mean, all of them in some way were marked as I was marked by hearing these stories. And that's truly the opportunity, and I believe the responsibility that we all have when we learn what is going on.
And yet, you did something, but most of us really, Ellen, read about things in the paper every day. We go like, oh, this is horrible, and we don't take action like you did. And so that's why I find your life so inspiring. I mean, you did something major. What do you think gave you that energy to do that?
You know, people ask me that question, Mary, and I have an answer that sounds superficial and almost silly. I felt like I had no choice. I heard these stories. I met Alice. I had been, as I said, to some of these terrible places. A Holocaust survivor once said to me that to be a bystander is to be as guilty as if you are a perpetrator yourself. And I
sins
felt,
of omission.
That's right.
As well as commission, right?
I simply could not walk away. So I get up every day and I do what I have to do. There's an obligation and a responsibility. I'm Jewish, and in my faith community, we are taught from being very little that we're here for one reason. And in Hebrew, the phrase is tikkun olam, and it means repair of the world.
Tikkun
olam,
olam.
repair of the world.
Ah, that's lovely.
And that's it.
So very deeply ingrained in your
Right.
life, isn't
Right.
that phrase?
I think for many people, for some people, they would like to do something, but they don't know what to do.
Right, very true.
And at my organization, we recognize that. And we try to have what we call action steps, simple things that people can do. To sign letters and petitions and to make phone calls and to be present at a rally, or even a small thing to support someone you know who may be going through a difficult personal experience. We don't have to all get engaged with the issues at a global level. If we all, though, can commit to one act a day, however small, if we all do that, just imagine how the world would be transformed.
You know, I know the phrase, of course, and hear it often, a random act of kindness,
Right.
but I've not heard the one act a day, and that's very catchy, Ellen. I like that.
Wouldn't that be
One
wonderful?
act a day. I mean, we've all got time to make one phone call, write
That's
one
right.
letter,
That's
reach
right.
out to one neighbor, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
The four things that you kind of focus on with World Without Genocide, remembering,
Yes. We
Help me.
believe that our mission is to protect, to prevent, to prosecute, and to remember. So let me say a little bit about that. To protect. We really try to engage in many ways to protect people who are being marginalized and discriminated against. And they could be people in our own communities, perhaps people who identify as LGBTQ. Perhaps they are Somali women who are wearing a headscarf and are being harassed. We encourage people, just go stand with her, be a friend. Ask if you could maybe have a cup of tea with her. So at a broader level, to protect people who are being marginalized, who are experiencing violence, what can we do from our own vantage point here to urge our governments, local, state, and national, to try to protect? To prevent, how do we empower civil society, whether it's, again, in our own community or somewhere overseas? To prosecute. There is a court called the International Criminal Court. It was formed as the legacy of the Nuremberg trials that happened originally in Nuremberg, Germany, after World War II. It was an international tribunal. The Allied nations came together to prosecute the worst of the perpetrators.
they're still doing some prosecuting, aren't they?
Indeed, they
And
are.
it continues.
Yes. But people who were involved in that court had this vision that there should be a permanent tribunal to prosecute the worst of the crimes on the planet. And finally, in the year 2002, the International Criminal Court began operating. It's located in the Netherlands, and it prosecutes individuals for 4 crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. And we advocate for people to learn about that court and to spread the word about the important work it does. 124 countries on the planet have ratified the founding statute of that court, but the United States has not.
Oh, I did not know that.
That's
Oh,
right.
how disappointing to hear that.
Indeed.
Thinking of the U.S. and disappointing things, just last week or the week prior, the U.S., our country, pulled out of the UN in terms of supporting the Human Rights Council.
Yes.
Your
That's right.
reaction to that, Ellen?
I was very disappointed, and the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said that the U.S. was pulling out because that council has proceeded to investigate issues having to do with Israel perpetrating crimes against Palestinians. Now, that's not a reason to pull out. She also said that there are many perpetrator countries represented on that council, and she denigrated the council. But our view is always that the individual representatives on that council are people who represent opportunities to engage with human rights, to take these important messages back to their own countries.
So, such a surprising move, really, from the country that should be leading,
Yes.
and is not in this case. And you also said there was a really interesting connection, you thought,
Exactly.
with a big report that just came
Yes.
out about poverty in our country.
Yes.
Can you connect the dots?
Absolutely.
There.
The UN released a report on the status of poverty in the United States. That report was released in May, and the United States withdrew from that council in June. And that report specifically criticized President Trump's policies by name. That report was presented to the United Nations Human Rights Council. And I just want to highlight some of those findings. The report was made based on significant investigation here in the United States. The report says the United States, and I'm quoting, has the highest rate of income inequality among Western countries. The $1.5 trillion in tax cuts in December 2017 overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy and worsened income inequality. 40 million Americans live in poverty, 18.5 million in extreme poverty, and 5.3 million, so in other words, like the population of our state, live in, and I quote, third world conditions of poverty, absolute poverty. 18% of US children live in poverty.
I had heard that, and that is, I mean,
Shocking.
all of these statistics are shocking, but that one is particularly shocking, isn't it?
The US has the highest youth poverty rate and the highest infant mortality rate of all the developed countries on the planet.
Now, this did not make the news in a way that one would think it would, did it?
No, it did not.
So you think, though, that there's a direct connection between our
Yes.
embarrassment about this and then pulling out of the council?
Yes, because Ambassador Nikki Haley said, and I quote, "It is patently ridiculous for the United Nations to examine poverty in America." She called the US, and I quote, "the wealthiest and freest country in the world," unquote. Now, if we think about the United States being the freest country in the world, we only have to think about the 2,300 children in detention camps, Mary.
Right. We are taping this show on June 25th of 2018, and so it's very much in the forefront of most of our minds.
Yes, indeed.
And you're right. This is such a shocking development on our border.
I want to go back to the Nuremberg court for a moment. One of the prosecutors from that tribunal back in 1946 is still living. He is the sole living prosecutor. His name is Ben Ferencz. He is now in his 99th year, and he continues to be a stalwart advocate for human rights. And he said just the other day that what the United States is doing with these children, with the separation from their parents, is a crime against humanity.
And just the fact that at 99, he's still involved, he's still speaking out, that is also such an inspiring kind of example, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Yeah,
He says to me all the time, I'm blessed to know him. He says he has 3 words that he would like to share as his legacy on the planet. Never give up.
that's
Never give up.
a motto, a mantra for all of us, isn't it?
It is indeed.
And with your work, I mean, that's got to fuel your passion to keep
Yes.
going. We just have a short time left. Can we look, Ellen, just a little bit at Syria as an
Yes.
example of outside our country, of a country we need to care more about, we need to do something about?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people don't understand what happened, and in a way the United States and many other countries are responsible. It started in 2006 because of the worst drought ever in that region. And we know that that's part of climate change, for which the Western nations are the most at fault for
Right,
what
with
we've
our-
done. And yet the US pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. Syria has devolved. There are an estimated 400,000 people who have perished. There are 14 million people who are displaced. And yet our actions have been almost nothing to try to truly take a stand.
I read that we took in only 33,000 last year. I think Germany took in 600,000. I mean, that puts it in perspective, doesn't it?
And we have taken in, I think it's 66 this year.
Since January.
66, yes.
So nothing really
Nothing.
in terms of
Nothing.
a scale.
No.
Do you blame our president? Do you blame our Congress? How do you think we get around this? How, as people who do care, what can we do?
I think that there are points of pressure that should have been exerted a long time ago. Under the Obama administration, when there were chemical attacks, former President Obama said, "That's it, that's a line in the sand, a red line," and the president of Syria crossed it. And then there were more chemical attacks and more, and there have been several hundred. And yet the United States did nothing. President Trump is an ally in many ways and lauds Russia's President Putin, who has been arming the Syrian government and really perpetrating the violence that is happening.
And then the reality of both Russia and China having veto power in the Security
Correct,
Council.
correct.
As I thought about your work this last week and read more, I realized how much of a block that puts into the UN having power to do
Right.
more.
But even when the UN does not have power, individual nations do, or individual
That's a
groups
good
of
point.
allies do.
That's a good point.
And there's so much that can be done short of boots on the ground. There can be economic sanctions and diplomatic efforts and political exclusion of groups and governments who are behaving so abominably. And we don't see enough being done. These are our brothers and sisters on the planet.
They're giving me the signal that we should give some information
Great.
for the viewers in terms of contacting you. And then when we come back, I want to ask you to tell the President Clinton story
Sure.
that you just told me. To learn more about Ellen's wonderful advocacy and prevention work, go to www.worldwithoutgenocide.org. Or you can call her, and I'll let you give your phone number, Ellen.
Thank you. Call me at 952-693-5206.
Thank you. Now tell us the Clinton story, because that says to me how we do make a difference,
Yes.
or not.
During the genocide in Rwanda, nearly 1 million people were slaughtered in 100 days. That's the length of a school semester. And former President Clinton was in office at that time. And he said after the genocide that he probably could have done something to save a few 100,000 lives, Mary. I mean, it's beyond our imagination. And he said he did nothing because he didn't hear from a single person in the House of Representatives or in the Senate asking him to do anything. He didn't hear from them, because they didn't hear from us.
That just almost gives me goosebumps because it makes me realize, one, what we can do, and two, the power that individuals have and need to take and use.
All of foreign policy is really up to us. The 435 people in the House, the 100 people in the Senate, they only have jobs because of us. They respond. When we call their offices, every call is noted. Every call has attention paid to it.
And each call, I read once, equals at least 100 to 200 other voices that would have a similar, take on the call. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for coming back and inspiring us and goading us into action. We need people like you to push us to tune into our hearts, and thank you for all you're doing. Ellen won the Anne Frank Award a couple years ago, which she said was one of her favorites, but she's also won a recent award from the UN for her work with human rights, and so we're lucky to have her here in our state. Thank you again. Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.